I'm Alexandra Roberts, 45, a career naval officer who worked her way up from a modest, no-connections home. For years, I kept my family afloat, covering bills, sending money, showing up. But when, at my grandmother's reunion, my parents joked I was still unemployed and told me to wash dishes, I drew a line that changed everything. Ever been belittled by people you carried? Tell me in the comments, you're not alone. Before I get into it, drop where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and self-respect. What happened next might surprise you. I grew up in a house where appearances mattered more than accomplishments. My parents preached discipline and respect at the dinner table, but those lessons seemed to apply only to their children, never to themselves. Our modest two-story home sat in the middle of a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business, and my parents made sure their version of our family story was the one being told. My mother collected porcelain figurines and displayed them in a glass cabinet that took up half the living room wall. She'd dust them every Sunday after church, handling each piece like it contained the secrets of our family's worth. My father drove a 10-year-old sedan, but waxed it every weekend until it gleamed like new. They understood the power of perception, even if they couldn't afford the reality behind it. I was the middle child, sandwiched between my older brother Marcus, who played football badly but loudly, and my younger sister Diane, who sang in the church choir with a voice that made people close their eyes and smile. I didn't have Marcus's confidence or Diane's obvious talent. What I had was reliability. While Marcus forgot to pick up groceries and Diane practiced scales in her room, I was the one who remembered to pay the electric bill, who tutored the younger cousins during family gatherings, who stayed late after school events to help clean up. My parents took this for granted. When relatives asked about their children, Marcus got credit for his leadership potential and Diane for her artistic soul. I got a polite nod and a comment about being dependable. At 17, dependable felt like a consolation prize. The decision to join the Navy came during my senior year, sitting in the guidance counselor's office looking at college brochures I couldn't afford. Mrs. Patterson had mentioned military service almost as an afterthought, but something about the structure and purpose appealed to me. When I told my parents at dinner, my mother set down her fork and stared at me like I'd announced plans to join the circus. "It's just a phase," she told Mrs. Henderson from next door the following week. "She'll get it out of her system and find something more suitable." My father was more direct. "Women don't belong on ships," he said, not looking up from his newspaper. "You'll be back home in 6 months." But I wasn't looking for their permission. I was looking for my own path, something that belonged to me instead of to their version of who I should be. The recruiter talked about education benefits, travel, and career advancement. More importantly, he talked about earning respect through performance rather than politics. During my junior year of college, funded by my Navy education benefits, my parents hit a rough patch financially. My father's hours at the plant had been cut, and my mother's part-time job at the department store barely covered groceries. Without being asked, I started sending money home from my weekend job and summer internships. $200 here, $300 there. Enough to keep the lights on and the mortgage current. They never thanked me directly, but they stopped making jokes about my military phase. When I graduated with honors and received my commission, my mother actually smiled during the ceremony. My father shook my hand afterward and said, "Not bad, kid." For them, it was practically a parade. My first deployment took me to the Mediterranean for 8 months. While my college friends posted pictures of weekend trips and new jobs on social media, I was learning navigation systems and maritime law, sending half my paycheck home to help with Diane's college expenses and Marcus's wedding costs. The sacrifice felt worthwhile. I was building something, contributing to something larger than myself, helping my family stay stable. But during phone calls home, I noticed a pattern. My parents would spend 10 minutes telling me about Marcus's new promotion at the bank or Diane's latest solo performance, then ask about my little Navy job like it was a hobby I'd eventually outgrow. When I mentioned my own promotion to lieutenant, my mother said, "That's nice, dear. Did I tell you Marcus bought a new car?" The imbalance became more obvious during my rare visits home. At church, my parents would beam while telling the congregation about Marcus's mortgage approval or Diane's engagement, but my military service warranted only a brief mention, usually framed as still finding herself. Their friends would nod politely and change the subject. I began to understand that my accomplishments didn't fit their narrative. Marcus represented traditional success, marriage, house, corporate job. Diane represented feminine achievement, engagement, teaching position, community involvement. I represented something they couldn't categorize or control. A daughter in uniform, unmarried and independent, earning respect in a world they didn't understand. During my second deployment, this time to the Pacific, I made lieutenant commander. The promotion came with increased responsibilities and a significant pay raise. When I called to share the news, my mother was more interested in planning Diane's bridal shower. My father asked if I'd met any nice officers yet, as if my career was just an elaborate dating service. The money I sent home had become expected rather than appreciated. When I suggested reducing my contributions to focus on my own financial goals, my mother's tone shifted. "After everything we've done for you," she said, "we sacrificed to raise you. This is your way of giving back." But I was already giving back. I was serving my country, representing everything they claimed to value: duty, honor, discipline. The problem wasn't my contribution to the family. The problem was that my success didn't reflect well on them in ways they could easily explain to their friends. A son the banker was impressive. A daughter the teacher was respectable. A daughter the naval officer was complicated. The shift became complete during my third deployment. My parents stopped mentioning my military service entirely in their social circles. When direct questions came up, they'd deflect: "She's still figuring things out," or "She's between opportunities right now." As if defending my country was a gap in my resume rather than the center of my professional life. I realized they were ashamed of what they couldn't understand, and rather than try to understand it, they'd chosen to diminish it. The daughter who'd quietly kept their household running, who'd helped pay for siblings' milestones, who'd built a career based on merit and service, had become an embarrassment because her path didn't match their vision of female success. The hardest part wasn't their lack of pride. It was their active minimization of something that had given my life meaning and direction. Every time they introduced me as still trying to find her way, they were erasing years of growth, achievement, and contribution. They were choosing their comfort over my reality. This was the foundation that would eventually crack completely. Not through dramatic confrontation, but through the steady erosion of respect, gratitude, and basic acknowledgement. They had taught me the importance of family loyalty, then demonstrated that their loyalty extended only to the versions of their children that enhanced their social standing. The family reunion would simply be the moment when that foundation finally collapsed entirely. The first cracks in our family dynamic appeared gradually, like hairline fractures in a foundation that had been under pressure for too long. I'd come home from deployment expecting the basic courtesies that military families typically extend to their service members, but instead found myself navigating an increasingly hostile environment where my career was treated as an inconvenience to their social narrative. My promotion to lieutenant commander should have been a celebration. Instead, when my parents attended their monthly church potluck, I overheard my mother telling Mrs. Garrett about Marcus's latest sales figures and Diane's wedding planning, but when Mrs. Garrett specifically asked about me, my mother's response was vague: "Oh, she's still doing her Navy thing. We're hoping she'll settle down soon." As if my military service was a rebellious phase rather than a 7-year commitment to national defense. The uniform obsession comments started around this time. My father would make jokes about my costume when I wore dress blues to formal family events, implying that I was playing dress-up rather than representing years of earned rank and responsibility. "Must be nice to have someone else pick out your clothes every day," he'd say, chuckling at his own wit. The jokes weren't malicious in tone, but they consistently diminished something I took pride in. What hurt more was their selective memory about financial contributions. When I'd sent money during their difficult period, they'd accepted it without question. But now, when relatives praised them for raising successful children, my contributions seemed to vanish from their recollection. Marcus got credit for his independence and strong work ethic, while my financial support became invisible, as if their recovery had been entirely self-generated. The entitlement began manifesting in phone calls that felt more like billing statements. "The roof needs repairs," my mother would say, not asking for help but implying obligation. "Your father's truck is making that noise again." These weren't requests, they were reminders of what they considered my ongoing debt for their parental investment. When I suggested they apply for a home improvement loan or consider a payment plan for repairs, my mother's voice would turn cold. "After 18 years of raising you, this is how you show gratitude?" But I'd been showing gratitude consistently through service, achievement, and financial support. The issue wasn't ingratitude on my part, it was their inability to recognize forms of success that didn't conform to their traditional expectations. My brother's suburban house impressed the neighbors. My sister's teaching job fit comfortable social categories. My naval career required explanation and context they weren't willing to provide. Family gatherings became exercises in social positioning. At my cousin Jennifer's birthday party, I watched my parents migrate toward the relatives with newer cars and larger homes, presenting themselves as peers rather than acknowledging the financial struggles I'd helped them navigate. When Uncle Robert asked about my recent assignment to a joint task force, my parents exchanged glances and my father changed the subject to Marcus's pending promotion to assistant manager. The extended family began reflecting these attitudes back to me. Conversations that used to include questions about my travels and experiences shifted toward gentle suggestions about alternative careers. "Have you thought about teaching?" Aunt Linda asked during Easter dinner. "With your discipline and organization skills, you'd be wonderful with children." The implication was clear. My current path was temporary, a detour before settling into something more appropriate for their vision of womanhood. Cousin Sarah, who'd recently graduated with a marketing degree, began treating me like a cautionary tale. "I can't imagine being away from home so much," she'd say with performative sympathy. "Don't you want to start a family? Time's not standing still." These comments, delivered with concerned smiles, carried the family's collective judgment about my choices. The most painful moments came during celebrations of others' achievements. When Marcus bought his first house, my parents hosted a dinner party and invited the extended family to tour the property and toast his success. When Diane got engaged, they threw a surprise party and spent weeks planning every detail. When I received my promotion to commander, the acknowledgement was a brief phone call and a suggestion that I not mention it too much at the upcoming family barbecue because it might make others feel uncomfortable. This pattern of selective celebration sent a clear message. Achievements that enhanced the family's social standing deserved recognition and support, while achievements that complicated their narrative should be minimized or hidden. My military service had become an embarrassment they tolerated rather than a contribution they valued. The undermining reached a peak during my cousin Michael's graduation party. I'd flown in during a brief leave period, arriving tired but wanting to support family. During the congratulations speeches, various relatives praised Michael's accomplishment and bright future. When someone mentioned that I'd also achieved significant milestones recently, my mother quickly redirected, "Let's focus on Michael today. This is his moment." The implicit message was that my accomplishments were inappropriate to mention, even in passing, during a family celebration. Later that evening, I overheard my parents talking with my aunt and uncle on the back porch. "She's always away," my mother was saying. "What kind of life is that for a woman? No husband, no children, just moving from base to base. We're worried she's missing out on what really matters." My father added, "All that education and training, and for what? To take orders from people she's never met." Standing in the kitchen, listening to them discuss my life like it was a failed experiment, I felt something fundamental shift. They weren't concerned about my happiness or fulfillment. They were concerned about their ability to explain my choices to their social circle. My independence threatened their narrative of successful parenting, and rather than expand their definition of success, they'd chosen to diminish my achievements. The realization was crushing but clarifying. For years, I'd been trying to earn their respect and recognition while they'd been systematically undermining both. They'd trained their extended family to view my career as a phase, my independence as selfishness, and my service as an obstacle to real success. This was the foundation of resentment and disappointment that would make the family reunion not just personally painful, but publicly humiliating. They weren't just failing to support me, they were actively working against my reputation within our family circle. The reunion would be the culmination of years of this systematic undermining, the moment when their narrative would be presented to the entire extended family as established fact. The betrayal wasn't a single moment of cruelty. It was years of accumulated dismissal, disguised as concern but functioning as control. The family reunion was planned as a celebration of my grandmother's 80th birthday, bringing together relatives I hadn't seen in years. I'd requested leave specifically for this event, flying cross-country during a brief break between assignments. The venue was my Uncle Robert's farm in Virginia, with its sprawling lawn perfect for the large gathering my grandmother had always dreamed of hosting. I arrived Saturday morning to find the party already in full swing. Cousins were catching up over coffee, children ran between the adults, and the smell of barbecue filled the air. My grandmother hugged me tightly, her face lighting up with genuine pride. "My granddaughter the commander," she whispered in my ear. "I tell everyone about you." Her words were a brief warmth before I rejoined the larger family dynamic. The atmosphere was festive and comfortable, the kind of gathering where people naturally fell into familiar roles and conversations. I found myself talking with cousin Jennifer about her new job in marketing, listening to Uncle Paul describe his recent fishing trip, and watching my young nephews play touch football with characteristic family competitiveness. These were the moments that reminded me why family mattered, despite the complications. As the afternoon progressed, people began sharing updates about careers, relationships, and accomplishments. Marcus announced his recent promotion to regional sales manager, earning applause and congratulations from the gathered relatives. Diane shared news about her upcoming marriage and the house she and her fiancé had just purchased. The mood was celebratory, supportive, and inclusive. When the conversation naturally turned to me, I felt the familiar tension but hoped that surrounded by extended family, my parents might show a different side of their attitude toward my career. Instead, what happened next would replay in my memory for years. "And what about our Sarah?" Aunt Linda asked with genuine interest. "We never hear enough about what you're up to." My mother's response came with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, she's still unemployed," she said, her tone carrying just enough amusement to signal that this was meant to be funny rather than cruel. The word "still" implied this was an ongoing situation rather than a mischaracterization of active military service. The comment landed like a stone in still water, creating ripples of confused silence. Several relatives looked puzzled, knowing that I was obviously employed by the United States Navy. But before anyone could ask for clarification, my father jumped in with his own contribution. "Maybe she can wash dishes for once," he added, grinning at his own joke. "Lord knows she never helped with them at home." This was completely false. I'd been responsible for kitchen cleanup throughout high school, but it served to reinforce the image of me as lazy and unhelpful. The room erupted in laughter. Not the uncomfortable laughter of people unsure whether something was funny, but genuine amusement from relatives who had been primed by years of my parents' subtle undermining to see me as the family disappointment. Cousin Michael chuckled and shook his head. Aunt Patricia covered her mouth, trying to stifle her giggling. Even Jennifer, who'd been friendly moments before, smiled and looked away. I stood there in the center of their amusement, holding a plastic cup of sweet tea, feeling the blood drain from my face. 7 years of military service, multiple deployments, leadership responsibilities, and financial contributions to my family's stability had been reduced to a punchline about unemployment and dishwashing. Everything I'd accomplished, every sacrifice I'd made, every moment of pride in my service had been erased by 2 sentences delivered with perfect comedic timing. The worst part wasn't the humiliation itself, it was the realization that this moment had been orchestrated. My parents hadn't spontaneously decided to mock me in front of the entire extended family. They'd been building toward this for years, conditioning relatives to see me as a failure so that when the moment came, everyone would laugh along instead of questioning the cruelty. What made the betrayal complete was the audience's participation. These were people who'd known me since childhood, who'd watched me grow up, who should have recognized the disconnect between my parents' characterization and my obvious accomplishments. Instead, they laughed because my parents had given them permission to laugh, had framed me as the acceptable target for family humor. I couldn't defend myself without seeming defensive. I couldn't explain my actual career without appearing to boast or contradict the family narrative that had just been established. I couldn't even leave the conversation gracefully without confirming their implication that I couldn't handle criticism or jokes. So I stood there, silent, while the laughter continued around me. My grandmother looked confused, but didn't intervene. My siblings weren't present for this particular conversation, having wandered off to other parts of the gathering. The relatives who might have questioned the characterization were either too polite to contradict their hosts or genuinely believed what they'd heard. The conversation moved on to other topics, but the damage was done. For the rest of the afternoon, I felt the shift in how people interacted with me. Instead of asking about my work or experiences, they offered gentle encouragement about finding the right path and not giving up. Instead of treating me as a peer, they treated me as someone who needed support and guidance through difficult times. My parents had achieved exactly what they'd intended. They'd publicly established their version of my story, gained the family's sympathy for having to deal with a disappointing daughter, and positioned themselves as patient, long-suffering parents rather than people who'd been financially supported by the child they were now mocking. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was strategic. They'd used the family reunion as the perfect venue to solidify their narrative about my life, knowing that once the story was told in front of the entire extended family, it would become the accepted truth. They'd weaponized my love for our grandmother's birthday celebration, knowing I wouldn't cause a scene or fight back in that setting. Standing there in the aftermath of their calculated humiliation, I realized that this wasn't parental disappointment or concern. This was deliberate destruction of my reputation within our family, executed with precision and supported by years of careful preparation. They hadn't just mocked me, they'd erased me. I needed air. The laughter had died down, but the atmosphere remained charged with the residual energy of a successful joke at my expense. I excused myself quietly, walking toward the farmhouse with what I hoped looked like casual purpose rather than retreat. My face felt hot, and my hands were shaking slightly, physical reactions I'd learned to control during military briefings and high-pressure situations, but which seemed unmanageable in the face of family cruelty. The farmhouse kitchen was empty, giving me a moment to process what had just happened. Through the window, I could see the reunion continuing without me. Children still played on the lawn, adults still clustered in conversation groups, and the general atmosphere remained celebratory. My public humiliation had been smoothly absorbed into the day's events, becoming just another moment of family bonding through shared laughter. But the laughter hadn't been shared. It had been targeted, designed to establish hierarchy and social position at my expense. I'd been transformed from family member to family joke in the span of 30 seconds, and everyone seemed comfortable with this new dynamic. I thought about my deployments, where respect was earned through competence and maintained through consistent performance. In the military, rank meant something measurable. Authority came with responsibility. When someone questioned your decisions, they did it within a framework of professional development rather than personal destruction. The contrast with my current situation was stark and painful. Cousin David found me there, leaning against the kitchen counter and staring out at the reunion. He'd always been one of the more thoughtful family members, someone who listened more than he spoke and observed dynamics that others missed or ignored. "You don't deserve this," he said quietly, closing the kitchen door behind him. "What they just did out there, it wasn't right." His words were the first acknowledgement I'd received that the situation had been inappropriate rather than amusing. The relief of having someone recognize the cruelty was overwhelming, but it also highlighted how isolated I'd become within my own family. "They've been building up to this for years," I told him, surprised by how clearly I could see the pattern now. Every conversation, every gathering, every time they introduced me to someone new. They've been positioning me as the family disappointment so that when they finally said it publicly, everyone would already believe it. David nodded. Your mom's been making comments about your situation for a while now. I always thought it was weird, considering you're obviously successful in your career. But she'd talk about you like you were struggling, like you needed guidance and support. The confirmation that my parents had been systematically undermining my reputation within the extended family was both validating and devastating. It meant my perception of their behavior was accurate, but it also meant the damage was more extensive than I'd realized. The thing is, David continued, everyone knows you send money home. Marcus mentioned it once, how you helped with his wedding costs and Diane's college expenses. But somehow that never comes up when your parents talk about you being unemployed. This was the final piece of understanding I needed. My parents hadn't just been downplaying my career, they'd been actively concealing evidence that contradicted their narrative. My financial contributions, which should have demonstrated both my success and my generosity, had been hidden from family discussions to maintain the fiction of my failure. I realized that their behavior wasn't about disappointment or concern for my future. It was about control and social positioning. They'd invested years in creating a version of me that served their purposes, the struggling daughter who justified their continued authority and generated sympathy for their parental burden. My actual success threatened this narrative, so they'd worked to suppress and distort it. Standing in that kitchen, I felt something fundamental shift in my relationship with my family. The daughter who'd tried to earn their approval, who'd sent money home during their difficult periods, who'd scheduled leave around their important events, began to disappear. In her place was someone who understood that approval earned through diminishing yourself isn't approval at all. It's exploitation disguised as affection. The reunion continued outside, but I was no longer the same person who'd arrived that morning hoping for family connection and acceptance. I'd learned something crucial about the difference between family loyalty and family abuse, between supporting relatives and enabling their cruelty. I wasn't angry yet. Anger would come later. In that moment, I felt something more powerful and permanent: clarity. For the first time in years, I could see my family's behavior without the filtering lens of hope and obligation. They'd shown me exactly who they were and what they thought of me. The question now was what I intended to do with that knowledge. The sound that cut through the reunion chatter wasn't immediately identifiable. At first, it seemed like distant thunder, but the sky was clear and blue. Then it grew louder, more rhythmic, unmistakably mechanical. The distinctive whump-whump-whump of rotor blades approaching. I heard the conversations outside beginning to pause, voices trailing off as people looked up to locate the source of the growing noise. Through the kitchen window, I watched relatives crane their necks toward the sky, hands shading their eyes against the afternoon sun. The helicopter appeared over the tree-line, military green with official markings, flying low and purposeful. It wasn't the casual flyover of a training exercise or the distant passage of aircraft traveling to somewhere else. This helicopter was heading directly toward us. I felt my pulse quicken, not with anxiety but with recognition. Navy helicopters had been part of my daily environment for years, but seeing one here, in this pastoral family setting, created a surreal disconnection between my two worlds. Whatever was happening, it was official enough to warrant direct contact during my approved leave. The aircraft circled once before settling into a landing approach on the largest open section of Uncle Robert's lawn, about 100 yards from the main gathering. The rotor wash sent napkins flying and forced people to hold down loose clothing, but rather than scattering in annoyance, the family clustered together to watch this unexpected arrival. I walked out of the farmhouse and toward the landing zone, my military training automatically taking over. When a helicopter finds you during personal time, it's never social. This was either an emergency requiring my specific expertise or a critical change in my assignment status that couldn't wait for normal communication channels. The engine noise made conversation impossible as the aircraft settled onto the grass. Through the cockpit, I could see two pilots in flight suits, their faces serious and professional. In the passenger compartment, a figure in dress uniform was already preparing to disembark. The family had gone completely silent now, their earlier laughter and chatter replaced by fascination and concern. Children pressed against their parents, wide-eyed at this dramatic interruption of their afternoon. Adults exchanged puzzled glances, clearly wondering what kind of emergency could bring a military helicopter to a private family gathering. As the rotors wound down to a safer noise level, the passenger door opened and Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stepped out. I knew him from the Pentagon Liaison Office, a career officer with impeccable bearing and the kind of formal demeanor that left no doubt about the seriousness of his presence. He approached me with quick, purposeful strides, his expression respectful but urgent. Behind him, I could see the pilots maintaining their positions, engines still running. This wasn't a social visit or a planned pickup. This was an interrupt protocol, used only for situations that couldn't wait for normal scheduling. "Admiral," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now quiet reunion. "Sorry to interrupt your leave. We need you at the Pentagon immediately." The words hit the gathering like a physical shock. I watched my family's faces change in real time, expressions shifting from confusion to disbelief to something approaching fear. My mother's hand went to her throat. My father's mouth fell open slightly. Relatives who had been laughing at jokes about my unemployment 30 minutes earlier now stared at me as if I'd transformed into a completely different person. Because I had. Or rather, they were finally seeing who I'd been all along. "Admiral," my mother whispered, though in the sudden stillness her voice carried to everyone nearby. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison waited for my response, but his presence and formal address had already communicated everything necessary. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or military courtesy extended to a lower-ranking officer. This was a senior official addressing a flag-rank officer whose immediate presence was required for matters of national importance. The family gathering had become completely frozen, a tableau of shock and realization. Uncle Robert, who owned the farm, looked like he was trying to process having a military helicopter on his property. Aunt Linda's expression had shifted from confusion to something approaching awe. Cousins who had been casual and familiar with me all afternoon now seemed unsure how to act in the presence of someone whose rank they were just beginning to comprehend. But it was my parents' reaction that captured the full magnitude of the moment. The smug confidence they displayed during their public humiliation of me had evaporated completely. My father's face had gone pale, and he seemed unable to close his mouth. My mother kept looking between me and the helicopter as if she couldn't make the connection between the daughter she'd just mocked and the officer being summoned to the Pentagon. "Yes, sir," I replied to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, my voice automatically taking on the crisp professionalism that had become second nature over years of military service. "What's the situation?" "Details in transit, Admiral. We have a helicopter standing by to take you directly to Andrews, then a flight to Washington. This is Priority Alpha." Priority Alpha meant national security level importance. It meant my expertise was needed for something that couldn't be delegated or delayed. It meant that while my family had been treating me like an unemployed failure, my actual career had positioned me as someone whose knowledge and judgment were considered essential to military operations at the highest level. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children had stopped moving, sensing the gravity of the situation without understanding its details. In the space of 2 minutes, the family reunion's entire dynamic had been inverted. The daughter who had been dismissed and humiliated was now revealed as someone whose responsibilities extended far beyond anything they had imagined. I looked around at their faces one more time, seeing years of dismissal and mockery being replaced by shock and something that might have been embarrassment. They were finally seeing me clearly, not through the lens of their expectations and social concerns, but as the person I had actually become through years of service and sacrifice. "I'll need 5 minutes to collect my things," I told Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. "Of course, Admiral." As I walked back toward the farmhouse to grab my overnight bag, I could feel the weight of their stares following me. Behind me, I heard the first whispered conversations beginning, relatives starting to process what they had just witnessed and what it meant about everything they thought they knew about me. The reunion was over, at least for me. But more than that, their version of who I was had ended permanently. The walk to collect my belongings felt like moving through a different world than the one I'd inhabited 30 minutes earlier. Family members stepped aside as I passed, not with the casual courtesy of relatives making room, but with the formal deference people show to authority they don't fully understand but instinctively recognize. I could hear fragments of whispered conversations as I moved through the gathering. Did he say Admiral? That's a really high rank, isn't it? I thought she was just. The questions multiplied behind me, but I was no longer part of their speculation. I had become someone they realized they didn't know at all. In Uncle Robert's guest room, I packed my overnight bag with the efficient motions that had become automatic through years of rapid deployments. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd taken leave specifically to attend this family celebration, to maintain connections and show support for my grandmother's birthday. Instead, I was leaving to handle responsibilities that my family had never bothered to understand or acknowledge. When I returned to the main gathering, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was standing at a respectful distance from the family groups, but his presence had created a bubble of formal atmosphere that affected everyone nearby. Children whispered instead of shouting, adults spoke in subdued tones, and the casual energy of the reunion had been replaced by something more careful and conscious. My grandmother approached me, her 80-year-old frame still carrying the dignity that had always made her the family's emotional center. "I don't understand everything that's happening," she said quietly, "but I'm proud of you." I always have been. Her words meant more in that moment than any recognition I'd received from my parents over the years. She represented the family's capacity for unconditional support, something that had been notably absent from my parents' approach to my career and choices. As I hugged her goodbye, I could see my parents standing together near the barbecue pit, their faces showing a mixture of confusion and what looked like dawning comprehension. They were beginning to understand that their version of my story, the unemployed daughter, the family disappointment, the subject of jokes about dishwashing, had been not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong. The helicopter's rotors were already beginning to spin up as I approached, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison walking beside me with the natural coordination that comes from years of military operations. The family had gathered at a respectful distance to watch the departure, but their earlier casual familiarity had been replaced by something more formal and uncertain. My mother took a few steps toward me, her face showing the kind of expression people wear when they're trying to process information that doesn't fit their existing understanding. "Sarah," she called, having to raise her voice over the increasing rotor noise. We didn't know. But there was no time for the conversation that statement might have led to, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it anyway. The helicopter was on priority alpha protocols, which meant personal considerations took second place to operational requirements. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison said to me, gesturing toward the aircraft. I climbed into the passenger compartment, my movements automatic despite the surreal nature of the situation. As I strapped in, I could see my family through the window, still standing in their loose cluster, watching this departure that none of them had anticipated or understood. The helicopter lifted off smoothly, and I watched the reunion shrink below us, Uncle Robert's farm becoming a patch of green, the family becoming a small group of figures, their individual faces no longer distinguishable. In the space of minutes, I had transitioned from family member to military officer, from the butt of their jokes to someone whose expertise was needed at the Pentagon. But the transition felt less like a dramatic transformation and more like a return to my actual identity. The person who had stood silently while being mocked about unemployment was the anomaly. The officer being flown to Washington for national security consultations was who I had been all along. As we flew toward Andrews Air Force Base, I thought about the family I was leaving behind. They would spend the rest of the reunion trying to reconcile the daughter they thought they knew with the admiral who had just been summoned to the Pentagon. They would replay conversations and comments from previous gatherings, looking for clues they had missed or ignored. They would ask each other questions about my career that they should have asked me years ago. Most importantly, they would have to confront the fact that while they had been treating me as a failure, I had been serving at levels of responsibility and authority that none of them had imagined. The unemployed daughter they had mocked was actually someone whose professional judgment was considered essential to military operations at the highest levels of government. The helicopter banked east toward Washington, carrying me back to the world where my contributions were valued and my expertise was respected. Behind us, the family reunion continued, but it was no longer the same gathering. In the space of 10 minutes, their understanding of one of their own had been completely overturned. The silence that had fallen over the gathering when Lieutenant Colonel Harrison called me Admiral was still echoing in my memory. It was the sound of assumptions crumbling, of narratives being forced to confront reality, of a family finally seeing what they had chosen to overlook for years. But I was no longer concerned with their reaction or their process of understanding. The helicopter was taking me toward responsibilities that mattered more than family politics, toward work that had meaning beyond social positioning and domestic drama. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. The aftermath of the helicopter departure created a vacuum of understanding that my family struggled to fill. According to David, who called me weeks later, the remaining hours of the reunion were dominated by confused conversations and uncomfortable realizations. Relatives who had laughed at jokes about my unemployment now found themselves trying to explain to their own children why they had participated in mocking someone of such obvious importance. My parents, he told me, had become almost invisible for the remainder of the gathering. They'd retreated to quiet corners, avoiding the questions and looks that followed them wherever they went. Uncle Robert had approached my father to ask about my actual rank and responsibilities, but my father had no answers to give. He genuinely didn't know what I did for the military beyond the vague notion that I worked on ships. The questions multiplied throughout the afternoon. How long has she been an admiral? What kind of work does she do at the Pentagon? Why didn't anyone mention this before? My parents found themselves unable to provide basic information about their own daughter's career, a fact that became increasingly obvious and embarrassing as the day progressed. Aunt Linda had pulled my mother aside to express confusion about the earlier jokes. "I don't understand," she'd said. "If Sarah's an admiral, how is she unemployed?" My mother's response, according to David's account, was a stammering attempt to explain that they'd been concerned about my personal life rather than my professional success. But the explanation satisfied no one, least of all my mother herself. The revelation had destroyed more than their immediate social standing at the reunion. It had exposed years of either deliberate deception or willful ignorance about my life and career. Relatives began remembering conversations where my parents had downplayed my accomplishments, dismissed my contributions, or redirected attention away from my achievements. The pattern became impossible to ignore once people started looking for it. My parents' struggle wasn't just about embarrassment, it was about the complete collapse of their authority within the family dynamic. They had positioned themselves as the wise, concerned parents of a disappointing daughter. Now they appeared as either liars who had deliberately misrepresented me, or as remarkably uninformed about their own child's life. Neither option reflected well on their judgment or credibility. The extended family's reaction was more complex than simple embarrassment. Some relatives, like David, felt genuine regret about their participation in the earlier mockery. Others seemed angry about being misled, feeling that my parents had used them as unwitting participants in a campaign of diminishment. A few appeared to be reassessing years of family interactions, wondering what other assumptions might be wrong. But the most significant change was in how they related to my parents. The couple who had commanded social respect through their apparent stability and good judgment now seemed unreliable narrators of their own family story. If they could be so wrong about something as basic as their daughter's career success, what else might they have misrepresented or misunderstood? For me, the Pentagon assignment turned out to be a strategic planning consultation that lasted 3 weeks. The work was challenging and important, exactly the kind of responsibility that had drawn me to military service in the first place. While my family processed the revelation of my actual status, I was contributing to policy decisions that would affect military operations worldwide. The irony was inescapable. While they had been treating me as someone who needed their guidance and support, I had been providing advice to senior military leadership on matters of national importance. The unemployed daughter, who couldn't be trusted to wash dishes properly, was helping to shape defense strategy at the highest levels. When I returned from Washington, I made a deliberate choice not to contact my parents immediately. This wasn't punishment or retaliation, it was boundary setting. The daughter who had once rearranged her schedule to accommodate their expectations and maintain family harmony no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood that relationships based on respect were worth maintaining, while relationships based on control and diminishment were not. The first contact came from my mother, 3 weeks after the reunion. Her voicemail was awkward and uncertain, a far cry from the confident authority she'd always projected in our family interactions. "Sarah, honey, we should probably talk. There seems to have been some misunderstanding about your work situation. Could you call when you get a chance?" The language choice was telling. She framed the revelation of my actual rank and responsibilities as a misunderstanding rather than acknowledging years of deliberate minimization. She positioned herself as someone seeking clarification rather than someone who owed explanations or apologies. Even in her attempt to rebuild contact, she was trying to maintain control of the narrative. I didn't return the call immediately. This wasn't spite, it was the recognition that responding on her timeline would reinforce the same dynamic that had created the problem in the first place. She was accustomed to my immediate availability, my accommodation of her schedule, my prioritization of family peace over my own boundaries. Those patterns needed to change if any real relationship was going to be possible. When I finally did call, 2 weeks later, the conversation was stilted and careful. My mother's tone carried none of her usual confidence, and she seemed uncertain about how to address me now that she understood my actual professional status. The daughter she could casually dismiss was gone, replaced by someone whose judgment was valued by senior military leadership. "We're proud of you," she said, but the words felt rehearsed and late. "We always have been. Maybe we just didn't express it well." But the issue hadn't been expression, it had been active suppression and deliberate misrepresentation. They hadn't failed to mention my achievements, they had worked to hide them. They hadn't been unable to understand my career, they had chosen not to learn about it. The difference mattered, and I wasn't willing to pretend otherwise for the sake of family comfort. "I think we have different definitions of pride," I told her. "People who are proud of their daughter's accomplishments don't joke about her being unemployed at family gatherings." The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. She was discovering that the new version of our relationship would require her to account for her behavior rather than simply have it accepted and forgiven. This was unfamiliar territory for her, and she seemed unprepared for the level of honesty the conversation required. The call ended without resolution, but with a new understanding between us. I was no longer willing to absorb their discomfort, accommodate their narrative preferences, or prioritize their social standing over my own dignity. They would need to decide whether they wanted a relationship based on mutual respect or no relationship at all. The transformation in our family dynamic was permanent and irreversible. The daughter who had sent money home, rearranged her schedule for their events, and accepted their dismissal of her achievements was gone. In her place was someone who understood that love without respect isn't actually love, it's control disguised as affection. 6 months after the reunion, I received a birthday card from my parents. Inside was a generic message and a newspaper clipping about women in military leadership, along with a handwritten note, "Saw this and thought of you. We're learning." It was a small gesture, but it represented the beginning of their acknowledgement that they had been wrong about fundamental aspects of my life and character. The card sat on my kitchen counter for days before I decided how to respond. Eventually, I sent a brief thank you note, polite but not warm. Rebuilding trust would require more than newspaper clippings and belated recognition. It would require them to confront why they had chosen to diminish me in the first place, and whether they were willing to change the patterns that had created such damage. The family reunion had been intended as a celebration of my grandmother's milestone birthday. Instead, it became the moment when years of accumulated disrespect finally met reality. The helicopter landing wasn't just a dramatic interruption, it was the arrival of truth in a setting that had been carefully constructed around lies and wishful thinking. My parents' authority within our family had been based on the assumption that they understood their children and could speak accurately about our lives and achievements. The revelation that they had been spectacularly wrong about their own daughter's career destroyed that authority permanently. They would never again be able to define my story for others, because everyone had seen how wrong their definition had been. The relationship we eventually rebuilt would be different, more careful, more honest, and more limited. But it would also be more genuine, based on who I actually was rather than who they needed me to be for their own comfort and social positioning. The daughter who had tried to earn their approval was gone, replaced by someone who understood that approval earned through self-diminishment isn't worth having. The helicopter had taken me back to my real life, but it had also delivered a message to my family. Respect isn't optional in healthy relationships, and authority that depends on keeping others small will eventually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. 2 years later, I received a promotion to Rear Admiral and a new assignment to head a joint task force on maritime security. The promotion ceremony was held at the Naval Academy, with full military honors and an audience that included senior officials from multiple branches of service. It was the kind of recognition that represented the culmination of 15 years of dedicated service and professional growth. I sent my parents an invitation, not because I expected them to attend, but because I wanted to offer them the opportunity to see who their daughter had actually become. To my surprise, they accepted. They arrived at the ceremony looking uncomfortable but determined, dressed in their best clothes and carrying themselves with the careful dignity of people who knew they were out of their element. During the reception afterward, I watched them struggle to make conversation with military officials whose ranks and responsibilities they still didn't fully understand. But they were trying. My mother asked thoughtful questions about my new assignment instead of changing the subject. My father listened when colleagues described my previous achievements instead of dismissing them with jokes. They were learning to be proud of something they had never bothered to understand, and while the effort was late, it was genuine. The conversation we had afterward was the most honest we'd shared in years. They acknowledged that they had been wrong about my career, wrong about my contributions to the family, and wrong about their approach to our relationship. They couldn't undo the years of dismissal and mockery, but they could commit to different behavior going forward. We didn't know how to be proud of something we couldn't explain to our friends, my mother admitted. Your brother's job made sense to us. Your sister's life looked like what we expected. But you were doing things we couldn't categorize or understand, so we tried to make you fit our expectations instead of expanding them. It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever receive, and it was enough. Not because it erased the damage they had caused, but because it represented their acknowledgement of responsibility and their commitment to change. The relationship we rebuilt was smaller than what we'd had before, but it was more authentic. They no longer tried to control my narrative or diminish my achievements to fit their comfort level. I no longer sent money home or rearranged my schedule to accommodate their expectations. We met as adults with separate lives rather than as parents and child locked in patterns of obligation and resentment. My career continued to advance, taking me to assignments around the world and responsibilities that required expertise my family would never fully comprehend. But they stopped trying to minimize what they couldn't understand, and they started trusting that my choices had wisdom even when they couldn't see it. The extended family dynamic had changed permanently as well. Relatives who had participated in mocking me now treated me with a combination of respect and embarrassment. Some, like David, became closer friends once the family hierarchy had been disrupted. Others maintained polite distance, perhaps uncomfortable with the reminder of their own poor judgment. The reunion story became family legend, told and retold at subsequent gatherings with varying degrees of accuracy and interpretation. In some versions, I was the hero who had been wronged and vindicated. In others, I was the family member who had been too secretive about her success. But in all versions, it marked the moment when assumptions were challenged and relationships were forced to become more honest. My grandmother, who lived for 3 more years after that birthday celebration, became one of my strongest supporters. She made it clear that she had always been proud of my service, and she began introducing me to her friends at church as my granddaughter, the Admiral. Her pride was simple and unconditional, uncontaminated by social expectations or personal agendas. When she passed away, I was granted emergency leave to attend her funeral and serve as one of the pallbearers. My parents watched with what looked like genuine pride as I performed the military honors for her service, and afterward my mother said quietly, "She always knew who you really were." The years following the reunion taught me that justice doesn't always come through confrontation or revenge. Sometimes it comes through the simple persistence of truth, which eventually becomes impossible to ignore or suppress. My parents' narrative about my life had collapsed not because I fought it, but because reality finally overwhelmed their ability to maintain the fiction. The daughter who had stood silently while being mocked at the family reunion was gone, replaced by someone who understood that demanding respect isn't aggressive, it's necessary. The woman who had tried to earn love through self-diminishment had learned that relationships requiring such sacrifice aren't worth maintaining. I found fulfillment in work that mattered, in colleagues who valued competence over politics, and in a life built around service rather than social expectations. The approval I had once sought from parents who couldn't see my worth became irrelevant compared to the respect I earned from people who understood the value of my contributions. The helicopter that had landed at the family reunion hadn't just taken me to an important assignment, it had carried me back to my authentic self. The woman who climbed aboard that aircraft was the same person I had been all along, before family expectations and social pressures had convinced me to make myself smaller for their comfort. The best revenge wasn't anger or retaliation. It was standing tall on my own terms, when the world finally saw who I really was. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that while others had tried to define my worth through their limitations, I had built a life based on my own capabilities and values. The family reunion had been intended to celebrate my grandmother's 80th birthday. Instead, it became the day I stopped allowing other people's inability to understand my life to diminish my sense of its value. The laughter that had echoed across Uncle Robert's farm was eventually replaced by silence, then by the more complicated but honest conversations that real relationships require. In the end, the helicopter landing wasn't just dramatic vindication, it was the arrival of truth in a place that had been sustained by comfortable lies. And truth, once it arrives, changes everything permanently. The lasting impact of that afternoon extended far beyond my immediate family. Word of the reunion incident spread through our extended network, reaching family friends, church members, and community acquaintances who had heard my parents' version of my story over the years. The dramatic contrast between their narrative and reality created ripple effects that took months to fully manifest. Mrs. Henderson, our longtime neighbor, approached my mother at the grocery store weeks later with questions that revealed how extensively my parents had misrepresented my situation. "I'm so confused," she said. "You always talked about Sarah struggling to find her place, but my nephew looked up her military record online and says she's one of the youngest admirals in recent history. How does that work?" My mother found herself unable to explain the contradiction without admitting to years of deliberate minimization. The woman who had always controlled social narratives in her immediate circle was now facing questions she couldn't answer without revealing the depth of her own deception or ignorance. Similar conversations multiplied throughout their social sphere. Church members who had been praying for my employment situation, based on my parents' requests, now wondered why they had been misinformed about something so basic. Family friends who had offered sympathy for my parents' burden of supporting an adult child learned that I had actually been supporting them financially for years. The revelation forced my parents to confront not just their relationship with me, but their relationship with truth itself. They had become so invested in their version of my story that they had lost track of reality. The daughter they described to others bore no resemblance to the person I had actually become, and maintaining that fiction had required increasingly elaborate mental gymnastics. My father's reaction was perhaps the most telling. During our first phone conversation after the reunion, he said something that revealed the core of his struggle. "I don't know how to talk about you now. When people ask about my children, I always knew what to say about Marcus and Diane. But you, I realize I don't know what you actually do day to day." This admission exposed the fundamental problem in our relationship. He had never bothered to learn about my work because it didn't fit his framework for understanding success. Rather than expand his perspective, he had chosen to diminish my achievements until they matched his limited ability to categorize them. The process of rebuilding required him to acknowledge his willful ignorance about his own daughter's life. It meant admitting that his dismissive comments about my career had been based on prejudice rather than knowledge. Most difficult of all, it meant recognizing that his failure to understand my path didn't make it less valuable, it made his understanding inadequate. My relationship with my siblings also shifted in unexpected ways. Marcus, who had always enjoyed his position as the successful child, found himself having to recalibrate his understanding of family dynamics. His bank promotion, which had once seemed like the pinnacle of family achievement, now looked modest compared to my military advancement. During a rare family dinner 6 months after the reunion, he made a comment that revealed his own process of adjustment. "I guess I always thought you were jealous of my career. Now I'm wondering if I should have been paying more attention to yours." The statement wasn't an apology exactly, but it was an acknowledgement that our family's hierarchy had been based on faulty assumptions. Marcus was learning that success comes in forms that don't always translate easily to suburban social standards. Diane's response was more emotional and direct. She called me crying one evening, weeks after the reunion, to apologize for her passive participation in the family's treatment of me. "I knew they were being unfair," she said. "I knew you were successful and working hard. But it was easier to go along with their version than to defend you when you weren't there." Her honesty was painful but valuable. It confirmed that the family's dynamic around me had been consciously maintained rather than unconsciously developed. People had chosen to participate in diminishing me because it was more comfortable than challenging the established narrative. The extended family's adjustment process varied by individual. Some relatives, particularly the older generation, seemed genuinely shocked by the revelation and made efforts to rebuild their relationship with me based on accurate information. Others appeared uncomfortable with the disruption of their assumptions and maintained polite but distant relationships. Uncle Robert, whose farm had hosted the reunion, became unexpectedly supportive. He called me several months later to apologize for his family's participation in the mockery and to express genuine interest in my career. "I spent 30 years in manufacturing," he said. "I understand the value of competence and hard work. What I saw that day was someone whose competence had been hidden from us, and that's not right." His willingness to acknowledge the wrong and make amends represented the kind of relationship repair that was possible when people chose honesty over comfort. Not everyone made that choice, but those who did created space for more authentic connections. The professional world I returned to after the reunion felt like a refuge of sanity compared to the family dynamics I had navigated for years. In military settings, respect was earned through performance and maintained through consistency. Politics existed, but they operated within frameworks of shared purpose and measurable achievement. My colleagues had no difficulty understanding my value or my contributions. The strategic planning work I did was evaluated based on its quality and effectiveness, not on whether it fit someone else's social expectations. The leadership responsibilities I carried were matched by authority that people respected rather than questioned. This contrast highlighted how much energy I had been spending over the years trying to manage my family's perceptions while excelling in my actual career. I had been living in two worlds with completely different value systems, and the mental effort required to navigate that disconnect had been exhausting in ways I was only beginning to understand. The reunion aftermath also clarified which relationships in my life were worth preserving and which were based on unhealthy dynamics. Family connections that required me to diminish myself or accept disrespect were revealed as toxic rather than loving. Relationships that celebrated my authentic achievements and supported my actual goals proved their value through crisis. This distinction guided my approach to rebuilding family connections. I remained open to relationships that could operate on terms of mutual respect, but I was no longer willing to sacrifice my dignity for family harmony. The daughter who had once absorbed criticism and mockery to keep peace was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sustainable relationships require honesty from all participants. The story of the helicopter landing became something of a legend within military circles as well. Colleagues who heard about the reunion incident found it both amusing and telling about civilian misconceptions of military service. It became a cautionary tale about the importance of families understanding and supporting their service members rather than diminishing them. But for me, the incident represented something more personal and transformative. It was the moment when my two worlds collided, forcing truth to emerge from years of deliberate obscurity. The family gathering that was supposed to celebrate my grandmother became the setting for my own liberation from expectations that had never served my authentic development. Looking back, I can see that the reunion was inevitable. The gap between my parents' narrative and my reality had grown so large that some kind of reckoning was bound to occur. The helicopter simply provided the dramatic timing that made the revelation impossible to ignore or rationalize away. The lasting lesson wasn't about family dynamics or military service specifically. It was about the importance of living authentically even when others prefer comfortable lies. Truth has a way of surfacing eventually, and relationships built on false foundations will eventually collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. The helicopter that landed on Uncle Robert's farm that afternoon carried me back to my real life, but it also delivered a message that extended far beyond my immediate situation. Respect for others' authentic achievements and choices isn't just polite. It's essential for healthy relationships. When we diminish people to fit our limited understanding, we damage not just them, but our own capacity for genuine connection and growth. Thanks for listening to my story. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been dismissed, underestimated, or even mocked by your own family? How did you handle it? Drop your experience in the comments, and let's talk about what standing up for yourself really looks like. If you found something in this story that resonated, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear they're not alone.